We're happy to have our next speaker, who is Tameera Mohamed from University of Guelph. They will discuss terminology, including how systems of oppression, such as cisnormativity, play out on campus. I'm gonna let Tameera introduce herself with more details. So Tameera, I'm gonna let you start your video and everything and share your screen in 1 second. I'm just switching the speakers. Thank you. Oh, okay, yeah.
So I'm just going to share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see it.
Yeah, perfect, yeah.
So hi everybody, my name is Tameera Mohamed. I use she and her pronouns. I'm currently working at the University of Guelph, where my role is in the Department of Student Experience, and I'm supporting students who are transitioning to the University of Guelph who might experience barriers or kind of complications in their experience of transition to the university. So they might be first generation students, their parents didn't go to university, or they're marginalized in some other way, or living off campus, etc. So prior to that, I worked in the Diversity and Equity Office at Wilfrid Laurier University and have spent several years as a researcher exploring more so faculty experiences related to LGBTQ inclusion on campuses. What else can I say? I did my master's in sociology at Dalhousie University, and in September I'll be starting my PhD at Carleton in sociology, looking at queer gender identities and expression and sexuality. Okay, so for my component of the webinar, I'm going to be talking about key terminology and a little bit about what folks who are working in student affairs type roles but aren't explicitly in a role that focuses on LGBTQ plus inclusion or working with marginalized students, how we can make sure that we're creating a more inclusive environment and providing supports to students. So this is going to be relatively introductory, but hopefully will help to make sense a little bit of some of the things that Michael is talking about in terms of the findings of the study and some of the processes by which, for example, microaggressions are occurring. So my hope for the next 12 or so minutes is that we will recognize the key terms in the 2SLGBTQIA plus acronym, be able to discuss how exclusion and marginalization is experienced by folks in these communities, and consider some ways that we might, again, as I said, in other student affairs roles, support students in these communities. So I'm not going to go through each term separately because I'm hopeful that folks are somewhat familiar with it. But I did want to put the 2S LGBTQIA plus initialism up on the screen so that you can take a look at all of the identities that are included there. And of course, there's many more that come after the plus sign. And I'm hopeful that if you have questions about a specific term or you need clarification, you can ask that in the chat, and then in the question period, we could address it. What I am going to focus on are the terms trans and queer, because these are more so umbrella terms that we use, and there tends to be more confusion around these two terms and what they mean. So queer and trans are umbrella terms, which means that they're covering kind of a wide range of experiences or specific identities. And so queer is used by folks in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community to convey really any identity that's outside of heterosexuality. So queer as an identity doesn't necessarily denote one's sexual orientation in terms of like who they experience attraction, physical, romantic, sexual attraction to or not, but tells you that the individual does not identify as heterosexual. And as you may or may not know, historically, the term queer was used in the pejorative to denigrate folks in this community, and has been reclaimed in the past like 20-ish years to be used as an identity. And so it does also carry a political or community-based orientation in the sense that it is in an effort to kind of like disrupt or respond to heteronormativity, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And trans is also used as an umbrella term. It's the shortened form of transgender. And as Michael explained, it's used to describe individuals whose gender identity is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And Michael also used the term cisgender, which is used to describe individuals whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So both cis and trans, the prefixes of those words come from Latin. And so trans means like on the other side of or across, and cis in Latin means on this side of. And that can be helpful in understanding why we use those terms to describe gender identity and its alignment with sex assigned at birth. Okay, so those are kind of like the basic terms, and now I want to get more into the terms around processes of exclusion. So I have a diagram of sorts up here that's trying to show some of these processes and how they work together. So on the bottom right side, we have prejudice and violence, and that would be where you would see transphobia or homophobia, which tend to be the forms of discrimination or exclusion that we most readily recognize and most often talk about. So these are the more explicit forms of harm that are experienced by people in this community. But they work in tandem with these more subtle or less easily identifiable forms of harm. So systemic discrimination, as well as our norms and ideologies. And this is where we see heterosexism, cissexism, heteronormativity, and cisnormativity show up. And I'm going to explain what all those words mean, so don't worry. But I just wanted to show how those pieces kind of fit into this broader conversation around transphobia and homophobia. So I'm going to move away from talking explicitly about transphobia and homophobia and talk about these more subtle processes of exclusion, which are the areas where we might see things like microaggressions happening. And I think it's important to focus on these areas because we tend to think of post-secondary environments as more liberal, and that we might see less of these more explicit forms of violence and prejudice happening. But we are certainly seeing lots and lots of systemic discrimination, as well as norms and ideologies that are impacting the student experience, as Michael pointed out. So I'm using the analogy of an iceberg here, which I've seen other folks use to explain kind of how oppression operates. And so I've modified it to talk specifically about homophobia. So the analogy of the iceberg is meant to represent the idea that, with an iceberg, you see what's above the surface of the water, and that oftentimes there's tons that's happening below the surface of the water that's kind of upholding that smaller part. That's a lot harder to recognize. We might not be able to see it. We might not know how it's operating or how big it is. But it certainly is there and is necessary, and is what helps to create these experiences that we see above the surface of the water. So in this diagram, I've put homophobia on the top, and homophobia is, as most folks probably know, this dislike, fear of, aversion to, or discrimination against homosexuality or homosexuals. You may also hear the term like queerphobia, which is aiming to be a bit more inclusive of the diversity of sexual orientations, but ultimately queerphobia, homophobia is meant to be speaking to this aversion to or dislike of or discrimination against non-heterosexuality. And so above the surface of the water, we see physical violence, slurs, hate speech, and historically criminalization. And these would be these more explicit forms of prejudice and violence experienced by 2SLGBTQIA+ folks. But below the surface of the water, we have heteronormativity and heterosexism. So heteronormativity, which is the commonplace assumption that all people are heterosexual, and that heterosexuality is the norm or somehow a more natural expression of sexuality. And heterosexism, which is the belief that heterosexuality is superior and preferable. And so we see this show up in media representation. So how queerness is represented in the media, if at all. We see this in our sexual health education. So what kinds of bodies are being talked about? How is sex being defined? What kinds of relationships are being discussed or considered? In North America, people have the right to marry people of the same gender, but we can see this has only happened relatively recently. In the United States, this is certainly not the case. So that would be an example of heterosexism. And then even like the entire phenomenon of coming out, the idea that people would need to state that they are not heterosexual demonstrates the pervasiveness of heteronormativity. So we have a culture that assumes that everybody is and should be straight. And so if people do not experience their sexuality as such, they have to continually engage in this process of coming out. And so these kinds of experiences would be what are helping to create these more explicit forms of harm, but also are very pervasive and are probably more so the kinds of experiences that are creating the hostile or unwelcoming campus climate for 2S LGBTQIA+ folks. So the same iceberg analogy can be used to examine transphobia. And so similarly, the more explicit or extreme forms of transphobia exist kind of above the surface of the water. They're more easily identifiable. Most people would be able to see when an experience of homophobia or an instance of homophobia or transphobia is occurring in such an explicit way. So we see, again, physical violence, slurs, hate speech, and the medicalization of trans folks. And transphobia is defined as the dislike, fear of, or aversion to and discrimination against transgender people. And I've also included those who are outside of gender norms, because you don't necessarily have to be trans to experience transphobic violence, because the violence is in an effort to kind of contain gender into the gender norms that have been established. And so folks who express gender outside of gender norms could be victim to some of these experiences as well. And then below the surface of the water, we have cisnormativity and cissexism. So cisnormativity, similarly, being the commonplace assumption that all people are cisgender, or that being cisgender is the norm, and cissexism, which is the belief that being cisgender is superior and preferable. And so again, we can see this in media representation and our sexual health education, in the gender roles that people are expected to participate in. And also in, for example, on campuses, gendered bathrooms, also on campus and everywhere, gendered bathrooms, which you could put both above the surface of the water and below. Above because of the forms of violence and harassment that trans folks experience when they use bathrooms that align with their gender identity. But below the surface of the water, in the sense that like the entire phenomenon of having gendered bathrooms is in itself an example of cisnormativity, because it assumes that people can be neatly categorized into male and female, and that therefore they should be able to kind of navigate with ease these very, very gendered landscapes. Okay, so transphobia and homophobia, they're like kind of distinct phenomenons in some sense, but they also really are working together. So if you've heard of the concept of intersectionality, or the idea that different systems of oppression kind of overlap or work together to create experiences, we can see how homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and cissexism are kind of all operating in tandem with one another to create this like life course and experience around gender identity and sexual orientation. So we can see from birth, people are assigned a particular sex, male or female, and then we typically think, you know, it's a girl or it's a boy, and then we expect that individuals' gender identity will correspond with that sex assignment at birth. So we would expect someone assigned female at birth to identify as a woman, and then we would expect a gender expression that aligns with that, so a feminine gender expression in this case. Sexuality, so being attracted to someone of what is thought to be the opposite gender. So we would expect that a female assigned at birth would present very femininely, would be attracted to men, and then would engage in marriage and children with one person. So there's the monogamy piece as well coming up in this kind of trajectory here. So with that, I think that I am probably almost out of time. So I hope that provides like a little bit of information about some of maybe the terminology and some of the processes that we might see, things like microaggressions happening in this realm of heteronormativity or cisnormativity. And I think that the rest of the folks who are presenting in this webinar will be speaking more specifically to how you can address those kinds of situations. I did want to say a couple things about how we can, as student affairs professionals or people working in some kind of capacity with students or impacting students, but maybe not working in like a diversity and equity type role, what we can do to make sure that we're creating more inclusive environments and supporting students. So I just have a few points here.
It's fine. You still have like 3 minutes or so.
Oh, good. It's probably because I'm talking at rapid speed. So the first would be to, of course, challenge stereotypes about 2SLGBTQIA plus folks. So if you are hearing conversations or problematic statements or people talking in stereotypical ways, of course, to address that. To not be making assumptions about people's gender identities and or sexual orientations. So that can look like using gender neutral language and gender neutral pronouns to refer to folks when you don't know their gender identity, but also using gender neutral language to describe things like partners, etc., especially when you don't know how somebody identifies. And also in terms of the supports that you might offer students. So if you are in a capacity where you're working one-on-one with students and you're offering them a range of supports for a particular issue, not making assumptions about whether a particular student might benefit from supports around 2SLGBTQIA plus identity. So offering that information and those supports to all students and not basing that on assumptions or knowledge that you have. Alongside, or what goes kind of in hand with that, is being aware of the resources that exist on your campus. So do you know how to do a name change, or how folks would change their chosen name in documents and systems? Do you know where the gender neutral bathrooms are located on campus? Do you know what supports exist for 2S LGBTQIA plus students on your campus? Because having that information and sharing that information with students can be really significant in terms of helping them navigate the university environment, which is in itself, you know, heterosexist, heteronormative, cisnormative, cissexist. So being able to kind of disrupt that in any way by being able to provide that information really easily and readily can be really significant. Role modeling the inclusive language that you used, I kind of spoke to that a little bit already. I would suggest that wherever possible, you could integrate 2S LGBTQIA plus training or allyship training or inclusive training into training and workshops that you're offering for your student staff, to colleagues, at departmental meetings, etc. So that could look like sharing some information that you have, or bringing in a trainer to share some knowledge, and really integrating that awareness and knowledge into your general practice, because part of that is a recognition that we have lots and lots of students who will be accessing various services on campus and may identify as part of this community. And so making sure that you're creating an inclusive environment, regardless of what supports or services you're offering, is pretty critical. If you happen to be working in a student development type capacity, being critical of the literature around student development and support is pretty key, because that tends to not account for sexual orientation and gender identity that is outside of heterosexuality and being cisgender. And so thinking about our models and thoughts around student development and being critical about some of these key parts of the student experience for 2S LGBTQI plus students. And I'll just say two more things. One, to signal, you can signal your support. So that can look like, you know, in your office or in your space, putting up images or affirmations or quotes, etc., that signal your support to the community. But it can also, you can signal your support through making sure that you're choosing, for example, spaces for your meetings or workshops that are in buildings or on floors that have gender neutral bathrooms, right? So that goes back to that piece around not making assumptions about who's in the room or who are the gender identities and sexual orientations of the folks that you're working with. So you can assume that you may have students or colleagues, etc., who might require use of a gender neutral or gender inclusive bathroom. And so making sure that you're choosing spaces that have access to those resources can be really crucial to signal your support to those communities. And then the last thing I'll say is that continuing to learn and unlearn what you know about these identities and experiences. So being part of this webinar is certainly one key part of doing that. And with that, I will end and pass it off to whoever the next speaker is.